to the PD. So excited to have our guests here today. We have Karina Saechao.
Yay!
Excellent, y'all. So the reason why I even brought her on the show is because, spoiler alert, I am pursuing my PhD. This is the first time I've actually really just said that. So yes, I'm pursuing my PhD, and Karina has been one of the figures who has really actually supported me in this journey. I got to meet her after meeting another PhD student. And so I had to bring her on here because if you are watching this live, you might notice that she is a beautiful Black woman. And when we were talking, she talked about some of the challenges that she had and to overcome them. So I figured, why not bring her on the show to talk about this? Because I know that I'm not the only one on this journey. So, Karina, actually, I did post on my Praxis Speech Sister page, which is more so for aspiring speech pathologists. And I asked if anyone wanted to get their PhD, and there were 14 aspiring speech pathologists that said yes. So, yay! Now, of course, some of us were like, I've had enough school, master's is enough for me. But I will be honest, I think a lot of it just has to do with academia and a lot of some of the toxicity that we experience in academia. So I'm excited to get into that today, even debunk some of the myths around being Black in academia or being a woman in academia. So if you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and read your bio and then we'll get into it.
All right.
Yes. So Karina Saechao is a multidialectal cultural speech pathologist in California and Kansas. She holds a certificate as an assistive technology specialist and is a PhD student. Karina's research interests are in African American English, child language acquisition, and AAC. Karina is the founder and CEO of Golden Oak Speech Therapy and specializes in AAC, AT, AAE, language, literacy, and caregiver and education coaching. She does all the things. So, Karina, is there anything else that I might have missed with your bio? Anything else you'd like to share about yourself?
Well, that's a good bio.
Right? I didn't write it.
It's pretty comprehensive. I am one of the things that I say a lot, which probably is something that people already know about me, is that I am fifth generation Oakland in the Bay Area, although I do not live there right now. My family still lives there. And those experiences have absolutely shaped the way that I see the world, how I move through the world. And we'll talk a little bit more about that today. But that was a really good bio.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Well, then let me go ahead and ask you, what is your why? What brought you into the field? And why do you do the things that you do now?
Yes. So to start with, what brought me into the field? My uncle brought me into the field. So my uncle had a stroke when I was really young. I think my mom said like 3 or 4 years old. So I had only ever known him in a bed. He was bedridden actually for my whole life. He passed when I was 22. But even though his body didn't work the way he wanted it to, his brain was sharp. He remembered everything. He would watch TV, he kept up with the news, and he just was amazing. So there was an instance where my aunt was taking care of him. And so there was an instance where she was not able to clear the bed wound. And so he had a bed wound. And unfortunately, that meant that she had to go, she had to take him to a skilled nursing facility so that he could have the bed wound cleared. And so anyway, he told his nurse that his niece, me, wanted to be a physical therapist. And so that was true at that time. I think I was 18 years old. And she told him to come, bring me in, tell me to come in. So I went in, talked to them, and was like, hey, everybody here looks cool. So I decided that I wanted to ask about not really an internship, but to be able to job shadow them essentially. So I job shadowed the physical therapist, and then I asked for a job. And so I worked there all summer long. And then I met the speech therapist, and I was like, who is that lady? Why is she touching his neck? Why is she talking to him like that? It was just this really interesting experience. And so at 19 years old, I ended up changing my major. I was a sophomore in college, all because my uncle told, some nurse who told the executive director that his niece wanted to be a physical therapist. And so now I'm a speech therapist, which I love a ton. And so, my why though, and the reason that I chose to change career was, I think, just like showing up for my community, right? I think even like back then, I was not sure why I had never heard of a speech therapist. Clearly, I had heard of a physical therapist and like some of the other medical professions. But my why, which I'll talk about in just a little bit, is like the general underservicing of the Black community. And so we'll talk about that like a little bit later. But why is just like showing up for us.
Well, tell us. Well, first of all, you definitely do show up. Can you tell us a little bit about your PhD topic?
Yes. So I am working toward a PhD in child language. I am in the child language doctoral program at the University of Kansas, and I am in my 4th year. She made it. She made it. So I am hoping to finish up and to walk that beautiful stage. Everybody send me the good. Send me the good vibes, send me the prayers, send me everything. And I'm hoping to walk the stage on May 2025. So everything. I'm in comprehensive exams right now, working through them. And then I'll do my dissertation, and then I will be done.
Oh, thank God. Yes. Wipe sweat off. Yes. Well, I do actually want to start debunking some myths, because you are the owner, the founder, and the CEO of a private practice in the Oakland area, yet you're living in Kansas. So how do you balance that? What does that look like for you?
So I'm balancing that, I guess, in a few ways. So I need to start off by saying that I work in private practice because I have to, right? So like I love working in private practice. People will often say things like, "Oh my gosh, you're doing so much. I could never," until you have to, and that's the only choice that you have. So I want to start by saying I was not willing to work for $40 an hour or like $45 an hour when I knew that I could be making significantly more if I cut out the middle person and just did it myself. So there's that, right? But then that turned into Golden Oak Speech Therapy. And so, I started as a solo practice. I started as a sole proprietor. There was a clear need. And so I decided to of course, take the steps to grow the practice in the ways that feel really good for me. But the way that I balance those things is, I really do my best to, one, I have community, right? So I have a crew, I don't do this by myself. I am married to my high school sweetheart, who is also the love of my life, and is just amazing, right? So it's me and him and our dog, and she is like therapy herself. But I balance it because I have to, but then I also balance it by way of taking care of myself as much as I can, and nurturing and nourishing myself also as much as I can. Sometimes that comes in the form of people, sometimes that comes in the form of food. But I also do something called nerd joy, right? So I nerd out on the things that I want to nerd out on, and I save my time, right? To me, there's no such thing as free time. I don't even call it free time. If I am resting, I'm resting in that time, right? I don't say that I'm free, because I'm not, right? If I'm sitting on the couch, that's what I want to be doing, so I balance by being super intentional with my time, and then super intentional with the energy that comes into my space and into my time. And really, that's some of the only ways to make it work. I make it work because I have to, and then I make it work because I want to, and then I make it work by doing my best to put up and then uphold the boundaries that I need to be able to maintain myself and sanity, and to be able to show up for my family, both immediate and beyond, and then of course to show up for my friends too.
Well, I love the conversation about boundaries that you just mentioned. That was so needed, because I'm sitting here as you're talking. I'm like, ooh, wait a second. I've been breaking some boundaries of my own. I'm like, I might need to make some cancellations here pretty soon. So I am really thankful that you even said that to us today. So you mentioned your high school sweetheart, and just this doesn't have much to do with inequality, but I just need more of us in the PhD space. And there are 1,000 million reasons why we shouldn't get a PhD. And one of them is, oh, you won't have a love life if you have a PhD, or if you're married, it won't work out if you get your PhD. So, how do you balance being in a marriage, a committed partnership, while also being more or less committed to this doctorate?
I balance it by not overcommitting. And I balance it by also like having an amazing partner, right? Like there's only so much that I could do or any one person can do if they have a partner who is selfish or self-centered. It just is not going to work, right? So I think it's just as important for the person who's working toward the PhD or doctorate at all, to as it is for their partner, the other person, to be committed to. Like it is a commitment for our family, for me to be doing this. So as I said, he and I are high school sweethearts. We were best friends in middle school and high school. I started dating as sophomores, and then I went to school, then I went to graduate school, then we got married, right? And then I worked there for 6 years in the Bay Area where we're from, before I decided that I wanted to go back to get a PhD. And then he and I decided together that we were going to move thousands of miles away so that I could fulfill my dreams. And he wanted to see me fulfill my dreams just as much as I wanted to see myself fulfill these dreams. And that is the way that we're doing it, So I one of the things that happened is I was the person who cooked all of our meals, lunch and dinner. He cooked breakfast, but I was the person who was cooking lunch and dinner. And so we had to really balance. Like when we got here, he had to take like some of the things that I was doing off of my plate so that I could focus on school and the private practice. And then he took on those things. So this wonderful man learned to cook, y'all. When I say he could not cook before we moved to Kansas. He could cook breakfast. He could cook a mean breakfast. But after we moved here, he learned to cook like everything. And our first meal, I think, that he cooked like steak and mashed potatoes and some veggies. And I like went and washed my hair, right? Which was like a whole process, 2 hours, y'all. I like washed my hair. I styled it in the shower, the whole nine. Anyway, needless to say, I came downstairs and like our fire alarm was going on. And like, yes, our like home alarm was like 5 seconds from calling from calling 911 to send a fire department because it like was smoking and stuff. Anyway, he had burned some butter and it like smoked up the house. But guess what? Haven't done that since then. And he has taken it so seriously that we have like what feels like 5-star meals every night. So anyway, that was all to say that he committed to this journey just as much as I committed to this journey. And quite literally, the reason that I'm able to do this in the way that I'm able to do this and the way that people see me doing this is because I have a partner who wants to make sure that I succeed. So he never makes me feel bad for not like having the energy, not showing up in the ways that people expect a wife to show up, right? He just does it. I don't harp on him. I don't have to even ask him sometimes. He just does it. And then we let it ride until we do the next thing. So
what a blessing, y'all. Get you a purpose partner,
yes.
someone who pushes you closer to where you're supposed to be.
I love a purpose partner.
I love a purpose partner too. So shout out to y'all. Shout out to y'all. Y'all, if y'all don't follow her on Instagram already, Golden Oak. What's your Instagram name?
Golden Oak SLP.
Golden Oak SLP. I know that you give him a lot of shout outs on there, and y'all are just a fabulous couple. So shout out to him. So I hate to leave the conversation of our happiness and amor, but let's talk a bit about academia and your experience there and still debunking some myths. So one powerful question I have for you today, Karina, is have you experienced any trauma being in a predominantly white space, and how have you overcome those challenges as a Black woman?
Yes. It is like this question immediately brings a visual of the recent passing of the 2 Black women who were presidents of their universities. One in which I think it was just last week. It was devastating. And she essentially like passed away on stage, right? She like collapsed on the stage I think mid-speech even. And the most devastating part about reading the article was that the event went on as planned, right? And so like I feel like that is almost like a euphemism, an idiom, you name it, right, for how Black women are often viewed and treated in academia. And so, even at this little baby level, as a baby researcher and a baby academic, fourth year in, I definitely have had my fair share of trauma. So that is, let's just start there. And I think, I think before talking about like academia, I think like even as a clinician, so like I think the start of my experience as like one of the 3.6% is that I started my career and spent quite a few years there at a high school. And at this high school, I was the only Black professional on campus, from office staff all the way up to administrators, educators. And what that often meant for me, right, is that sometimes like people didn't know how to interact with me, like they didn't know what to expect, right? But the biggest problem is the frequency with which I would be the brunt of like microaggressions, right? And so even at my school, it was a small school, it was a really good school, but as speech language pathologists, we would often have to go out to other schools, regional centers, to non-public schools, to go and see children at those schools, go assess them, private schools, you name it. But when I think about the microaggressions around the consistent questioning about whether I could be or am the speech language pathologist, right? And so like for the first 3 years of my career, I would often get triple check, quadruple check. Let me check the email. Let me go ask my administrator if you're actually the person who's the speech language pathologist. And so the worst part, I think, is that I often was assumed to be, like, no matter what setting I was in, I was always assumed to be a new para, right? Who are you, the new para? No, right? Like, and we know we need paras, right? They are pivotal. They play a pivotal role in making sure that our classrooms can go round. But also, paraprofessionals do not typically, right? Like typically they are not people who have a master's degree in speech language pathology, right? And so like the trauma, I think, of being in primarily white institutions as a speech language pathologist, like started there. And then of course it ended up extending into academia. So I entered into academia. Of course, this process started before what became the global COVID pandemic, and unfortunately, super unfortunately, before the late George Floyd was murdered. And so like my experience began before then, but we all know that there was what people like to refer to as this like racial reckoning, right? Where people all of a sudden, were attempting to do these heavy lifts to show Black people that we care about them and that Black lives matter, right? So then what ended up happening, as we all know now, especially if you go up to any Black person, they will definitely tell you this. I mean, maybe I shouldn't speak for all Black people, but there was a ton of virtue signaling. There was a ton of gaslighting. And a lot of the things that happened were like the creation or the promise of the creation for like funding mechanisms, for DEI spaces that were dedicated to Black and Brown support and Black and Brown healing. And a lot of those things, if they came, they're gone now, right? But if they were promised, oftentimes they didn't come, right? And so like a part of the trauma that I experienced was upon my arrival into my program, it became like really clear that not everybody is communal, right? This was my first time. So I grew up, like I said, in Oakland, California, in the Bay Area. There is significant activism. Like the history of activism in Oakland is significant. It is so significant that even when the Raiders would lose, they would get out there and do the most. You know what I mean? Like that was their way of like being activists for, wanting like the local football team to win. You know what I mean?
Like,
yes.
Yeah.
think about like the Black Panthers were started there, right? And just down the road in Berkeley, the civil rights movement, or the disability rights movement, excuse me, was also started there, right? So the history of activism is like also in me. As a part of activism comes like collective culture, collective community, and that's what I grew up in. I grew up in a historically redlined neighborhood, right? My family, my siblings and I are fifth generation to live in that home, and that's true of many of my neighbors as well. And so when you talk about community, there is almost not a place in my little neighborhood, even at this big age, that I can go where I don't know the people there, right? Because that's the way community works, right? And sometimes even just seeing each other without not having ever met before brings community, right? Not all the time, but a lot of the time. So that was all to say that the first time in my big age that I had ever experienced the opposite of that, rugged individualism, right, was in academia. And it was so rugged, right? Like this individualism was so rugged that I had finally, met students and like other people who would do anything. And when I say anything, I mean anything, who would do anything to cut people down. And so like one of the things that was happening, or a pattern that became really clear, that I unfortunately was a victim of, and I unfortunately know a lot of other victims of, were essentially the thing that was happening is that people, non-Black people, were using Black people to boost their resumes, like their DEI resumes, right? So people were like getting into these DEI spaces, non-Black people specifically, were getting into these DEI spaces, in an attempt to tout themselves as DEI professionals. And the proximity alone, right, was what they were using to, to show, right, or to illustrate that they had been doing things that they actually weren't doing. And unfortunately, as a result, were causing significant harm to people. But then even if people, like the other people around, knew that that was happening, like nobody was doing anything about it, right? And so like my perception is, and my observation is that things have actually gotten really difficult, especially like they continue to be difficult, but I feel like in some capacities they've gotten more difficult for the Black community, because it's difficult to know who to trust, right? And so like in academia, there is a ton of competition, right? So you don't always know if you are partnering with somebody because they mean well by you, or if somebody wants to partner with you because they want to steal your ideas, they want to get funded, they can't make it without you. Look, I have DEI, right? There's a lot of DEI supplements, for when you're seeking funding. And so some people, most people, my experience so far, most people do not have like good intentions. And until I got here, right, like call me ignorant if you want to, right? But these things are not valued in the California Bay Area, right? So like where I'm from, if people would have act like this, you would have been nixed from the community, and everybody knows it, right? So like if that's not the culture, and that's not the culture of academia, but if that's not the culture that you came from, then that allows you to like use up people to get ahead, and then bam, you're done. And it happens all the time, right? So it's difficult to know who, and to like find people who, are really like committed to like the work that they're doing going forward, and like collaborating with people who really want to do this work without like abusing their status, abusing their power, like all those other kinds of things. And unfortunately, it happens at every level. So I know that feels like kind of vague, I'm not in a place yet where I feel like I'm ready to give specifics, but like when you see Black women, especially in academia, give them grace, because there are plenty of reasons every day, and plenty of examples, for Black women to choose themselves. And still, every day, there are Black women who show up and choose the work, who choose the community. And their way, including my way of activism for our community, is through education, is through higher education, and like being in spaces of higher education. So when you see a Black woman in academia, thank them, because it is really difficult to do. But we are out here doing it. So I encourage you to do it too, but to also like do what feels good for you. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit, but
Yes. Wow, Karina, you said so much with so much passion because I'm just thinking about, I mean, even more. First of all, can you break down what virtue signaling is? I haven't heard of that before. What's virtue signaling?
Yeah, so virtue signaling is like when you are essentially like saying that you're going to do something that you are 100% sure you are not going to do, right? Or like showing, trying to show that you are like an ally or an accomplice, but like you definitely don't intend to ever do that thing, right? So like it's really difficult because, like virtue signaling is really difficult because, there's this kind of like, yeah, you're great. I'll tell everybody that you're great. Like she's a
Mhm.
little bit, you know what I mean? Like there's this kind of, like when I don't feel like I'm explaining it super well, but like when you virtue signal, like essentially like the person attempts to be somebody that they know they never intend to be, but it's with really the intent, like it's purposeful, right? So it's like I think we've all heard of like intent versus impact, like with microaggressions and things like that. It's not that. Like virtue signaling is like intentional, like they intend to do harm by you. They don't know they don't know how much harm is going to be done, but they also don't care how much harm is going to be done, right? Like they're going to create these lines of funding so that they can say that they did their part, and then they're going to drop you off at the door, right? They recruited you into the program, they got you this and this, but they don't intend to support you while you're there, right? Like the retention part is more important than the recruitment part. Get them there and then what, right? Like retain them. And then how do you intend to retain them? What was the plan? You know what I mean? And
Mhm.
so like a part of like virtue signaling is that it's like this kind of self-centeredness, the selfishness.
Oh, well, then let me ask you this then. We talked about retention versus retainment. And I know we were about to talk about how there are a lot of Black women leaving the field. So can you just give us a reason why we're leaving the field and what could be done to change that and keep the retention?
I think I think there are a lot of reasons that Black women leave academia. Um, I think that one of the themes that I have been able to observe is that Black women are often, we often do a lot of work, right? There's this like superwoman trope for Black women. And so we're often called to do a lot of work. And then if we say no, right? Like if we put up this boundary and we say, we can't, right? Like we can't take on anymore. Not only is the plate full, but it's like spilling onto the table and onto the floor, right? Like people don't actually believe us, right? And they do believe us. That's the problem. They do believe us, but they don't actually care, right? So
Mm,
like there's this idea that Black women should be able to do it all, and Black women unfortunately have been forced to internalize this, like over generations of doing it all. And so like even at the epigenetic level, right, it's like just show up and smile. No, that's not how this works, right? So then what ends up happening is that we have this really long list of what Black women are doing, right? And nobody else in the department has a list that looks like theirs. In addition to that, Black women are often called to do work that only a Black woman can do, right? We have these Black and brown students over here. They really need some support. I don't understand anything about what they're telling me. I just can't relate. But I think that you can relate. Do you think that you can mentor these 5 Black students?
mm.
Right? So we often have to do work that there's no checklist for, right? Like there's no, like we volunteer. There are all these things that you have to do in academia to like keep up, to get tenure, to go to the next, right? To be to get like assistant professor, then to get associate professor. There are all of these qualifications that we have to meet, right? Like a certain level of publishing, like all those kinds of things, right? But then there are things like that are measured like impact factor, right? So like if you have an impact factor for a specific journal and their impact factor isn't high enough, but that's the journal that's going to reach the audience that you want to reach as a Black researcher, right? Or like somebody who researches Black communities, then that's not good enough. And now you're not going to get tenure. And now you actually have to go somewhere else and start the clock again. Right. And so like there are all of these issues that Black women face that are very specific to Black women. And my experience and observation has been if and when people can use Black women to do what they want to do, they absolutely will. Right. And this is not just in academia, right? Even in my profession, when I first started my profession, right, I had this like inkling that the white SLP, I mean, let's be real, all the rest of them are white, but that one of the other SLPs in particular in my school district, that she didn't have the caseload that I had. I was like, how is it that I'm not leaving here every day until like 4:30 or 5 o'clock, meanwhile commuting? And she was like twiddling her thumbs, you know what I mean? And definitely got out of there by like 3 o'clock every day. Come to find out, quite literally, when I had them like pull the caseloads down so that we could rebalance them, which I had to threaten to quit in order for them to do that. So like, let's be real about that too. But I also was like one of the people who was doing the most like significant kinds of work, like going out to assess these students, like in non-public schools and, in other areas like that. She had 32 students on her caseload and I had, you bet your bottom dollar, 68 students.
I knew it was going to be 60 or more.
And I was like, it's a no for me. If y'all don't fix this right now, I'm out of here. And they did. So gratefully, I had directors who did fix it right away, right? But this was also a new director to us. And so I was able to get to them pretty quickly. But I was also so deep in my conviction about leaving, which I think it was palpable, right? I was gratefully at the time living in a home with my mom and my husband and like could afford to do that. So I want to recognize that not everybody has that option, right? But I was so deep in my conviction that they knew I was serious and I was ready to bounce, So I think that there are at every level, clinically, right? Like in the schools, like in all these areas, right? But definitely in academia too. And I could like keep talking about that, so we could go on. But girl, they be out here tripping. And sorry to interrupt you. I think the other thing, going back to the other question that you asked me before about like how I balance having a private practice and then balance like being in school. I also want to add real quick to that as a graduate teaching assistant, I only make $18,000 a year, right? So when I said I have to, quite literally, I have to because I only make $18,000 a year. And in this day and age, I'm trying to figure out who can do that. Right? Like who can live on that? I don't have student loans. I don't have a car payment. Right. And still.
That's thank God. Right. But if you
thank God, right? Because I worked my little hiney off, but listen, and that's not true for everybody, but $18,000 a year, and then gonna think that that's something. If that's not something, what am I supposed to do with that? Anyway, so I wanted more context to that response.
Whoa, yeah, definitely giving us a lot to think about. So I'm thinking about, you mentioned microaggressions. Everything you just said. So I'm going to ask it like this. How are you able to keep pushing forward? How are you able to keep waking up every day and choosing, yes, I'm getting a PhD in this field. Yes, I'm entering the academic space. Despite all of these things that you know about it, what gives you that solace, that peace about it to keep going?
Because I do this for me and my community. Period, right? Period.
Yeah.
So, I actually have a picture of my great-grandmother and great-grandfather. My great-grandmother lived until I was 22. And my godmother, she is still living. She's 96 years old, right? People think that MLK and all of them, they always think that was like over 100 years ago, right? The photographs being gray is on purpose, right? You can find them photographs in color.
Yeah.
And I say all that to say that my ancestors who lived until I was well into my 20s, right? Like my grandmother was bused into the white high school in the city that she lived in the California Bay Area. She
Mm.
was bused into the white high school. She didn't graduate because the white kids used to spit on her and kick her and beat her up when she would go to school. And so she dropped out of school, obviously, because she didn't want to be beat up every day.
Right.
So she ended up essentially going on to beauty school, and she started her own business. That's where I get it from. Shout out to Grammy. So she started her own, her own cosmetology, whatever, beautician. She was a beautician. She started her own business. And she did hair and for her whole life. And her and Papa, like kept up the family and the bills and this, that, and the other. And I do it for them. I do it because they were not allowed to go to college, to like go to a university. They could go to a technical university. That's why she became a beautician. And she started her business. She was successful despite, right? But when I think about like my grandpa who wanted to be an engineer, he was not able to be an engineer. We know why, right? And so when I am not that far removed, they all were living until I was like in my 20s. And so I do this. I also do this for them. I do this for my ancestors who didn't even have the option to think about it, right? Like not only did they not have opportunity, right, but they did not even have the option to think about it, right? But then I also do it for like my younger family members and for my neighbors, right? Like I grew up in a historically redlined neighborhood. If the government had their way, secondary to systemic racism, I would not have made it, right? Like I would not be, like as successful as I am. And so I show up for that, like I show up for them. I am driven by the people who need me to come to their house and see their kids, right? Like I used to serve using a home health style, right? Service delivery when I started my practice is one of the reasons that I started my practice. I refer to it as a service apartheid. There was a service apartheid to Black and Brown communities. I think this happens everywhere, but definitely where I was living in the California Bay Area, nobody was coming into our communities to like serve the kids who live there, right? And so when I got wind of this, when I like figured this out, I decided to start the practice because I was like essentially like walking down the street and going into my own community to serve these families. And when I showed up to the first family's house, like the first family I had ever served in this capacity, she was like, I had a contract with like another agency, and she was like, "You're the speech language pathologist? Oh my gosh." And this grandma, it was the grandma, she hugged me so tight and started crying. And she was like, "I have never met a Black or brown SLP. I can't believe you're here." Right. And then she went on to tell me this story about how their previous SLP had made an assumption and essentially called the police on their child and with the grandchild. And like when I think about like the harm, right? So like two things, right? The service apartheid component of there is a deliberate, right? And like even if it's not deliberate, like, yeah, I understand why you don't want to go into that zip code, right? Like there's this kind of thing where like, nobody can make anyone do anything, but there are like whole slews of, like practitioners who are choosing not to go into communities because of whatever bias or whatever prejudice they have about those communities, right? And it's not even always a good fit. So like there's that too. But I don't use the word service desert because there are SLPs around, right? Like a service desert would indicate that there are no practitioners or like no providers around to serve these children. There are, they just won't show up, right? But then, like on the other side of that, like we have families who need grace, right? Like who need like understanding, who need somebody that can support them in meeting the goals that they have for their child, that doesn't come with this kind of like expert model of like, I have a master's degree, so I know what's best for you. And this is what we're going to do. Like that doesn't include, like talking with the family about their goals, for their kid and like the things that they also want for them. And so anyway, I think, I've answered probably like 3 questions by now, but
No, I mean, honestly, I'm just sitting here listening to you as the wealth of knowledge that you are and just taking it all in. I'm very happy that you mentioned family-centered care because I preach all the time how speech pathologists walk in, not even just speech pathologists, right? Healthcare providers walk in like we just know everything. We're just a bee's knees. And if you're walking in to a family that is a completely different culture than we are already, and obviously a completely different culture, it would actually behoove us to talk to them and ask them what their specific goals are, what their specific values are, instead of acting like we know everything because we don't.
Mhm.
So that is a very moving story about how that Black grandmother hugged you and cried, and how the speech pathologist intention versus impact, right? Probably had good intentions for that child, but it was impactful and probably traumatizing. And that's amazing. I actually just got off of a call about how Black parents, Black and brown communities, LGBTQ communities are afraid of healthcare and education because of the stigma and because of those experiences. So that grandmother could have easily been like, I don't want nobody else in my house from this point, And so that was brave of her to hire you. So I'm so thankful that you were that sunshine, golden oak face that she needed at that point. So we are at the time, Karina, but let me ask you this. What changes would you like to see done in higher education and in speech pathology in general moving forward?
I want to see radical, unapologetic change. I know that that does not name something specific, but our field in terms of like diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, understanding, like all those things,
Mhm.
is where it was 20 years ago.
Yeah.
There's no reason that in this day and age, that still only less than 10% of SLPs are people of color at all. I
Mhm.
want to see a complete like elimination of like gaslighting, virtue signaling toward Black and brown SLPs and multilingual SLPs who are heritage speakers of their language, right? I want to see like more people show up just like in general to like decrease ableism in the field, right? Decrease bigotry all around in the field,
Mhm.
and to really have a better understanding of why even cultural and linguistic diversity is important. So just like, it's like not enough that we just like show up as we are, right? Like representation is important, but also like I really want to turn everything on its head and have a real conversation, and take real action, like make real change, like yesterday,
Mhm.
around working toward balancing, like better balancing the races and ethnicities and the languages that are represented in the field.
Mm. Yes, and so I'm sitting here brainstorming. We're on the way, sis. We really are. We're on the way. So hopefully within 10 years, we will see that radical change that we're all talking about.
I hope so. And I made a note. I know you said that the last question was the last question,
No, go for it. I'm
but
normally the one who asks more questions after I say that's the last question. So please.
oh, okay. I only really had like one more question that I wanted to answer. And so there was a question that was posed to me, around like what advice I would give to someone questioning their capability of getting through a PhD program. And I have a few words of wisdom. And I want to start by saying to just like spend time with people and spaces and build routines that like fill you up, nourish you, people that will root for you. Like you deserve to like show up in spaces where every time you get there, people will like damn near clap. You know what I mean? They
Mhm.
will smile at you and they will welcome you in. You deserve that. And so like find that. Find your crew. In your crew, that's like your mentors, mentees, fellow doc students, current PhDs, people who are thinking about working toward a PhD, postdocs, and then lean into them and like reciprocate. I think that some people sometimes like they get a little, like this process is hard and it's easy to think about quitting as your first option. And when you hit a wall, just lean on it. right?
Love
You
that.
know, lean on it and then bust it down,
Lean
because
on.
that's what you do.
Oh, and then bust it down. I'm sorry. Say that one more time because I
Okay.
really I liked it so much.
Listen, when you hit a wall, lean on it first, right? Get your rest, and then bust it down.
Yeah.
The only other thing that I would say too is say no early and often. Take
Mhm.
what you need and leave the rest. I am still working on that. Take what you need and leave the rest. Create goals and focus on achieving them, and then find a task manager. I use Asana.
Okay. Trello's been my bestie for the past year. I love Trello.
Yay!
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you so much for that wisdom. I'm glad that you honestly took the time to say that because even outside of a PhD program, that is very well needed. And it means a lot coming from someone who's balancing a PhD program and a business. So thank you. Thank you a
Thank
thousand
you.
times. How can we find you if we want to contact you? Oh, and also before we go, I just want to say, I don't know if you know this woman, but Dorothy Gaspard, she is MEED She said, thank you for sharing your story. So,
Oh, thank
and
you.
thank you so much, Dorothy, for coming on to the show today.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that, Dorothy. You can find me at hello@goldenoakspeech.com if you want to send me an email. On Instagram, you can find me at Golden Oak SLP. And on Facebook, I'm at Golden Oak Speech Therapy. And I would love to hear from you. Thank you for having me on today. I appreciate you so much, Melanie.
Yay, Karina. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. And people in the chat are saying thank you so much. So I can't wait. I hope to have you back on when you do get the PhD.
Oh,
And
we gonna get it, right? It's more like when.
yes. Win. Thank you for correcting my language. Y'all, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Please come and visit next Wednesday. We'll be talking to Karen Dudek about neurodiversity affirming care. Thank you so much, Karina.